History does not begin this story where it should. It begins with a name already decided for you. Alexander the Great. The word great is doing work before any evidence is shown. It tells you how to feel before you are allowed to see. In 335 BC, a Greek city was destroyed. Not a foreign enemy. Not an Eastern kingdom. A Greek city. One of the oldest in the Greek world. Its name was Thebes. By the end of a single day, 6,000 people were dead. The streets were filled with bodies. The houses were broken open. The city was set on fire on purpose. This was not chaos. This was not rage. This was policy. Alexander was 21 years old. He had just taken his father's throne. And he needed the rest of Greece to understand something very clearly. Defiance would not be punished. It would be erased. The men of Thebes were killed. That part is recorded. What happened next is usually summarized in one sentence. The inhabitants were sold. 5 words. Enough to end the story. Enough to hide it. Because those words do not explain what it meant to be gathered outside the city walls. They do not explain what it meant to be sorted by age and strength. They do not explain what it meant to be priced. They do not explain what it meant to survive Alexander the Great. This story does not ask whether Alexander was a military genius. That argument has already been won. This story asks what his victories cost the people who never had a vote, never held a weapon, and never appeared in the statues. It begins at Thebes, because that is where the pattern was set. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Thebes did not fall by accident. History often makes it sound that way, as if events simply unfolded, as if violence arrived on its own. But Thebes was destroyed because a decision was made. In the autumn of 335 BC, Thebes was not a weak city. It was old. It was proud. It had a long memory of standing up to powerful enemies. It had defeated Sparta once. It had produced poets, generals, and leaders. It was Greek in every way that mattered. When Alexander became king, Thebes believed something important. They believed youth was weakness. They believed a 21-year-old king could be tested. So they revolted. Alexander did not negotiate. He did not wait. He moved south faster than anyone expected, bringing his army straight to the city. The speed was the first message. The second message came after the walls fell. When the fighting ended, 6,000 people were dead. Not wounded, not captured, dead in the streets where they had lived. The men who had fought were killed first. That was normal for ancient war. That part does not shock the sources. What followed was different. The city was not spared. It was not fined. It was not occupied. It was erased. Alexander ordered Thebes destroyed. Houses were pulled apart. Stones were thrown down. Only temples were spared. Only one poet's house was left standing. Culture mattered. People did not. The survivors were driven outside the city walls. Women, children, old people. They stood together on open ground, surrounded by soldiers. They already knew what was coming. Slavery was not a rumor to them. It was a system they had seen before. This was not rage after battle. It was organized work. The women were counted. They were separated by age. Children were pulled from mothers. Young women were moved into groups of their own. This was not written down in detail. The sources do not describe faces. They do not describe voices. They summarize it in one sentence. The inhabitants were sold. What that sentence hides is time. Days passed. Merchants arrived. Prices were discussed. The women of Thebes were not seen as victims. They were seen as supply. There were too many of them. 30,000 people at once. So their value dropped. A woman who would normally sell for a high price was sold for much less. Not because she was worth less as a person, but because the market was flooded. This detail is recorded carefully, not because the women mattered, but because money did. Some families chose a different ending. They locked themselves inside their homes and set them on fire. Parents and children burned together. The sources call this courage. They do not explain why burning felt like the better choice. Thebes was meant to be remembered, not as a city, as a warning. Every Greek city understood the lesson. Resistance did not bring negotiation. It brought disappearance. And for the women of Thebes, survival did not mean safety. It meant being carried away, named by someone else, and erased quietly. This was the beginning, not an exception. It was the pattern. The ancient sources move quickly after Thebes. They always do. A city falls. A number is given. A sentence closes the account. The inhabitants were sold. Then the story marches on with the army. But that sentence describes a process that could take weeks, sometimes months. And every day of that process was lived by people whose names were never written down. After the destruction of Thebes, the surviving population was gathered outside the city. This was not done in one moment. Soldiers moved through the ruins house by house. They searched cellars. They pulled people out of hiding places. They dragged the injured into the open. Women carrying children were forced to keep moving. Old people who could not walk fast enough were struck or pulled. The goal was not cruelty. The goal was collection. Once everyone was gathered, the sorting began. This was routine work. Greek armies had done it before. Slave traders knew exactly what they needed. Age came first. Very young children were separated. They were easier to sell alone. Mothers were pushed away even when they screamed. Young women were placed in another group. Their value depended on youth and health. Older women were grouped together. They were worth less. Some were worth almost nothing. The soldiers doing this did not see themselves as monsters. They were doing a job. Within the rules of ancient war, this was normal. That is what makes it harder to face. Merchants arrived soon after. Some followed the army closely, knowing what would come next. Others were called when the scale of the capture became clear. 30,000 people meant opportunity. The merchants examined bodies the way buyers examine animals. Teeth were checked. Hands were inspected for signs of work. Skin was examined for illness. Skills mattered. A woman who knew weaving was worth more. A woman who had worked in a household was easier to place. The history books note these details briefly, not to describe suffering, but to explain prices. The women of Thebes were too many. The market could not absorb them all at once. So the prices fell. This is written as an economic fact. Supply exceeded demand. What that means in human terms is simple. A woman's life became cheaper because too many women had survived. Some were sold nearby. Others were transported far away. A woman from Thebes could end up in Athens, or Corinth, or somewhere she had never heard of. She would not travel with family. Families were broken early in the process. She would be given a new name. Her old name would disappear. The sources do not follow her after the sale. Once the transaction is complete, she no longer exists in the story. That silence is not accidental. Ancient historians wrote about power. They wrote about kings and generals. A woman sold into slavery did not change the outcome of campaigns. So her life was not recorded. But this was the real result of Alexander's victory. Not the burning city. Not the dead soldiers. The quiet movement of thousands of women into lives they did not choose. Thebes was destroyed to send a message. The message worked. Other cities remembered what happened there. They did not remember the speeches. They remembered the women. And they understood what resistance would cost. After Tyre, Alexander turned east. His army, hardened by years of battle and long marches, moved toward Procepilus, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, the richest city in the known world, a place where kings had stored wealth collected from Egypt to India for centuries. Unlike Thebes or Tyre, Procepilus did not resist. The gates were opened. The garrison surrendered. The city submitted. By Alexander's own policy, submission should have meant mercy. But mercy, it seems, was conditional. Alexander's soldiers entered the city. Homes were searched. Treasuries were emptied. Silver, gold, silk, and gems were carried out. Private treasures were seized. And the women were taken, as they always were. Diodorus, the historian, describes it in unusually clear terms for his time. There is no passive voice here, no abstraction. Soldiers dragged women from their homes. Some resisted, some cried. None escaped. The army was not punishing defiance. There had been none. The city had surrendered. The army was paying a debt to its own exhaustion and desire for spoils. The royal treasury required 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to transport the loot. The soldiers claimed what they found in private homes as their own. The line between treasure and human life was invisible. Both were taken. Then came the fire. Not a calculated military action. Not a strategic necessity. A drunken act of vandalism, spurred by a suggestion from an Athenian woman named Tyre during the banquet. A torch was thrown. Gold and marble, painted ceilings, columns, carved staircases. Hundreds of years of Persian artistry burned. Alexander ordered the fire stopped, but it was too late. The city was scarred forever. And the women? They watched. They waited. They had no voice. They had no future in the city that had once been theirs. The fire erased not just buildings but the very possibility of return. Their lives, their freedom, their homes, all gone. The contrast is stark. Alexander treated the royal women of Darius with care, ensuring they had servants and comfort. The common women of Procepilus? Sold, taken, erased. Mercy was not morality. It was currency. Value was calculated in politics, strategy, and wealth. Those without political or economic leverage were expendable. Those with leverage were preserved. The women of Procepilus were ordinary, powerless, and unrecorded. Their lives mattered less than the gold they carried or the satisfaction of an army accustomed to domination. Their names disappeared into history, reduced to numbers and the 5 words repeated endlessly in chronicles. The inhabitants were sold. Alexander's greatness is taught in schools. His victories, his vision, his conquests immortalized. But the true cost, the hidden human suffering, the silent grief of tens of thousands of women, is omitted. The policy was clear. Submission spared the men of military age. The women, always, would pay the price. In the shadow of Procepilus, the pattern of conquest, cruelty, and calculated violence was fully visible. This was no longer theory. This was policy perfected. The lessons of Thebes and Tyre became reality in Procepilus. The conquered had no choice. The conquered had no voice. The conquered had no record, except the faintest trace in history's blind spots. After years of conquest stretching from Macedonia to India, Alexander's army reached the Indus River. The soldiers were exhausted. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and endured heat, hunger, and fear. They had seen cities burn, families torn apart, and children sold as slaves. Now, they refused to go further. At the Hyphas River, they mutinied. They were done. They wanted to go home. Alexander, at 30 years old, sulked in his tent for 3 days. Then, finally, he relented. The army would turn west. But Alexander was not content with following the established path. The known roads that led safely from India to Persia would not do. Instead, he chose the Jedroian desert, a barren wasteland stretching across modern southern Pakistan and Iran. A place where temperatures soared during the day, where water was scarce, and survival was uncertain. The desert had defeated great armies before. Cyrus the Great had tried and failed. Now Alexander wanted to succeed where the legends had failed. Not for strategy, not for necessity, for proof. Proof that he could achieve what no one else had. The army entered the desert, bringing more than soldiers. Baggage trains carried supplies, craftsmen, merchants, and women. These were wives, companions, and servants. Women whose lives were bound to the army's progress. They had no say in this decision. They did not vote. They did not negotiate. They walked because they had no choice. Within days, the lack of water became a crisis. Rations were cut again and again. Animals died first. With each death, supplies vanished. The army slowed, but survival demanded progress. Those who fell behind were abandoned. Women suffered disproportionately. They carried children, cooked, cleaned, and tended the wounded. When they collapsed from exhaustion, they were left to die in the sand. Some held the bodies of children who had already died, refusing to release them. The heat radiated from the ground, the sun scorched their skin, and the wind brought no relief. And then came the flash flood. A wall of water surged through the riverbeds where the army slept. In the night, it swept away soldiers, women, children, and animals alike. Those who survived climbed to higher ground, only to resume the march with nothing. No water, no food, no supplies, no hope. Casualty estimates are staggering. Plutarch suggests 3/4 of the army perished. Modern historians call this an exaggeration, but agree the death toll was catastrophic. Tens of thousands died. And yet, when historians recorded the losses, only the soldiers were counted. The women's deaths were invisible, unrecorded, unremembered. Alexander had chosen glory. The desert was the proving ground. But the cost of proof was measured in lives, not his own, not his officers, but those of the powerless following behind. The silent victims of ambition, strategy, and ego. The desert proved his point. He had done what Cyrus could not. But at what cost? The men survived to tell the tale. The women did not. Power, ambition, and desire are often measured in achievements. But what is the worth of a victory built on lives uncounted, grief unrecorded, and suffering ignored? In the Jedroian desert, Alexander's proof was clear. The strongest survived. The weakest died. The powerless had no voice. The desert was not just a path. It was a judgment. It was history in motion, showing what conquest demanded of those who could not refuse. After the desert, Alexander's army moved west. The campaign had pushed further than any Greek had ever imagined. Cities had fallen, populations enslaved, families destroyed. Yet even amid this chaos, Alexander's historians praised his mercy when he captured royal women. After the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, the Persian king Darius III fled, leaving behind his family, his mother, Sisagames, his wife, Statioe, and his daughters. To the world, Alexander treated them with honor. He provided food, comfort, and protection. He told Sisagames she could consider him a son. He attended Statira's funeral when she died in childbirth a year later. The ancient accounts celebrated this as evidence of his nobility, wisdom, and moral character. But the truth is far more calculated than kind. The Persian women were political tools. Darius still commanded loyalty from his provinces, keeping his family alive and well ensured that Alexander maintained leverage. Every gesture of courtesy was a calculated investment, a way to preserve influence, not to express compassion. Meanwhile, the women of every other city faced a different reality. The women of Thebes, Tyre, Procepilus, and countless smaller towns were enslaved. They had no political value. Their survival offered no bargaining power. Their lives were measured in market value, not humanity. They were sorted, sold, and transported across the empire with the same efficiency used to move supplies or treasure. In 324 BC, Alexander staged a mass wedding at Susa, Persia. 80 of his officers married Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself married two, Tyre, Darius's eldest daughter, and Persetis, the daughter of the previous Persian king, Artaxerxes III. The ceremony was lavish, conducted in Persian style, and celebrated as a visionary act of cultural unity. But for the women, it was possession, not choice. They had no say. They were symbols of power, trophies of conquest, tools in a grand political display. Their fathers, husbands, and families had been killed or enslaved. Their presence at the ceremony was coerced, their compliance assumed. Within months, nearly all the Macedonian officers abandoned their Persian wives. The vision of unity dissolved overnight. The Persian women were left to navigate a shattered world. Their status, once political, vanished. Their marriages were never about love or equality. They were about control, strategy, and ownership. Alexander's treatment of the royal women and the women of conquered cities reveals the truth behind the label great. Merit, virtue, and justice were applied selectively. Mercy was reserved for those who could serve a strategic purpose. Everyone else was expendable, their suffering invisible to history. By the time Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, at only 32, his empire stretched from Greece to India. His generals turned on one another immediately. Wars of succession began, reshaping the Mediterranean world. The women he had enslaved remained enslaved. The cities he had destroyed remained ruined. The families he had torn apart continued to live with the consequences of a man whose greatness had a human cost measured in silence and blood. Alexander's story, as recorded in history, celebrates military genius, political strategy, and ambition. It does not tell the stories of the powerless. The women sold, the children orphaned, the families erased. The world he conquered was built on destruction. The legacy of greatness is inseparable from the legacy of suffering. To understand Alexander's true impact, one must look beyond the battles, the victories, and the celebrated acts of mercy. One must see the unrecorded grief, the uncounted lives, and the human cost of empire. The women who were enslaved, abandoned, or forced into marriages were not mere footnotes. Their experiences reveal the darker truth of what it meant to follow a conqueror, to live in the shadow of someone deemed great. History remembers Alexander as a genius, a visionary, a king. But history almost always forgets those whose lives were sacrificed to achieve that vision. The women, the children, the powerless, these are the ones who bore the weight of his empire. Their stories, though silenced for centuries, speak louder than any statue, any title, any record of conquest. And in their stories, the word great takes on a very different meaning. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.